So this is the first kind of, I suppose, lecture type video that I'm doing on this channel. Let me know what you think. It's a bit longer form. It's a little bit more in detail. I'm going to try and cover an entire topic. In this one, I really want to talk about velocity-based training as it relates to strength specifically. So powerlifting, strongman, people trying to maximize their 1RM, maximize the amount of weight they can lift. And so velocity often has some misconceptions in that space. So I thought it'd be worth unpacking some of those and then talking about some of the specific applications of how we would use strength and how we'd apply velocity in a strength training context. To start though, we need to talk about how velocity is fundamentally linked to performance training, but not in a sense of you need to just do fast training. It's more that velocity is a marker of progress and an indicator of your progress on strength training. Athletes and coaches already do this. They already perform a subjective assessment of velocity. They kind of feel how fast something is. So we're already doing this idea. It's like that idea of, oh, that was so easy, those weights flew up, or that squat was a real grind, it was really slow today, that feels really heavy. We sort of gauge our readiness, how well we're training and how well we're lifting and how strong we are based on how quickly we can move the weights. And so there is that intrinsic link between velocity of the movement and ease of the movement. And we can objectively measure it. That's what velocity-based training does. Strength, when we talk about developing strength, it's not just about weight on the bar. So strength is sometimes called force, and force is a product of the mass, so the load we lift, that's important, but also the acceleration we apply to that load. So if you don't move a load at all, you aren't going to develop strength through that range of motion if your goal is, say, a powerlifting situation. Yes, you can exert force against a static bar, like for an isometric mid-thigh pull on like a force plate, but if your goal is to move the weight and successfully complete the rep, then you need to accelerate it. And to create more force, generate more force, you need to create more acceleration or lift more load. And so we can do both at the same time in our training to make progress and to help us increase our strength and our force production capacity on movements like squat, bench, and deadlift if we want to move through a range of motion. And so in those senses, velocity-based training is kind of like GPS for the weight room. If runners nowadays can have on their smartwatches or whatever it might be, they have GPS data and they can measure their pace, they can measure frequency, splits, all these different things when they're running. And so in the weight room, we don't really have that same tool, but velocity-based training can do that. So in the macro, it can help us track progress, recognize overreaching before it happens, so we don't let ourselves get burnt out by working too hard or too frequently or whatever the case may be. And in the micro, within a session, it can help us adjust loads, just tweak things through it, maybe take a rep off or add a rep to a working set based on whether we're feeling good or feeling bad. Increase intent as well, so it can motivate us to do better, maybe in a high volume block. When you're not lifting those massive weights and getting after new PRs, you can still track and assess, are you doing well, and try and lift those submaximal loads really fast, increase acceleration, and therefore increase velocity. So there's a lot of misconceptions about velocity, especially when it comes to strength training. It's kind of dismissed a lot by strength athletes and coaches because, well, my goal is weight. And absolutely, weight is still more of a priority than velocity, but velocity can help you achieve more load on the bar if you use it correctly. The problem is a lot of people think, well, velocity-based training, it's based on velocity. The name suggests that. So therefore I need to be lifting sub-maximal loads really fast. And it's not about that at all. It can be in, say, athletic development situations, say if you're trying to train high rate of force development, but for strength, that's not really a goal. So we use velocity-based training, we use velocity data differently in our training. So VBT is not about training fast. It's a relative term. So velocity is relative to the context. So what a good velocity is for you or for me or for a different lifter is contextual based on your previous velocity. So I'm in the gym, I'm doing trap bar deadlift and I'm lifting 140 kilos. The only thing I compare that 140 kilo trap bar deadlift to is to my own 140 kilo trap bar deadlifts from the past. I can't compare it to someone else's because they might be taller, shorter, maybe they're using blocks, maybe they're coaching it differently, or maybe there's different things at play. And I can't compare it to my 150 kilos because the load change will mean that the acceleration mass relationship is going to be different. So those velocities aren't comparable. So what I want to see over time is that my 140 kilo lift increases in velocity, showing that I can lift it with more acceleration and therefore exert more force. So the movement, the load, our readiness, individual variables like limb length and height, they will all influence our velocity. Velocity instead in strength training, it's really a method for tracking progress. So velocity PR is a number we'll talk about soon that I think is really valuable. or using a session worth of data and profiling an athlete to estimate their 1RM or estimate their complete maximum strength on a single lift based on some sub-maximal sets is a really cool thing you can do in strength training settings using velocity data. And the other thing that velocity does in strength training is it's an indicator of fatigue and readiness. So it can show you whether you are in fact a little more burnt out than you think, because velocity is more sensitive to changes in readiness and fatigue levels than strength is. So you might still be able to grind out those weights, but you probably, potentially shouldn't do that and should instead have a little deload, back off things to allow yourself the space to recover. There's no point continuing to train super hard if you're already burnt out and exhausted. You're only going to get yourself more burnt out and more exhausted and take yourself away from the ultimate goal, which is to peak on the platform in a powerlifting example. The other misconception about VBT is that it's a universal training system. Once you start training with velocity, it solves all your problems. All you have to do is worry about the velocity numbers and that's it. Unfortunately, though, that is simply not the case. Velocity is just a piece of the puzzle. It's just part of your training. It can't solve all the problems in your training program, in your scheduling, but it can help. So you still need to have a good program. You still need to have good structure. You still need to make sure you're focusing on technique, things like that, reps, sets, loads, weight. All these things, RPEs, they're all still really valuable numbers that go along with velocity. So velocity is very much a complementary metric in that sense. You program it in with those other numbers, or you consider it within the context of everything else that's going on in your training. So just like a runner doesn't base every single decision they make based on pace from their GPS data or the deep GPS technology they're using when they're running, they also consider frequency, so how often they're running. So same thing here. How often are you lifting? How often are you exposing yourself to a squat stimulus or a deadlift stimulus? How heavy are you going? So how fast are you running? All those variables will come into it as well as you're training. So the first one we want to talk about is 1RM prediction or estimation using velocity. So this is the load velocity profile. What happens is as you lift heavier weights, as you perform sets or individual reps at those loads, you'll be able to do them at a slower velocity. The heavier weight just means you can't move it as fast. And we're talking about mean velocity here. So the mean velocity from the bottom of the rep to the top, that's your mean concentric velocity for a rep. I'll be referring to that as velocity throughout the presentation. So each load you lift will go down in velocity. And that tends to be a pretty linear relationship. Not perfect, but pretty linear. So as you lift heavier weights, they'll go down in a linear fashion. Now, because this relationship is pretty stable and pretty consistent for most people, we can use that to estimate 1RM. So if we extend out past, say in this example, the athlete did 115 kilo top single here in this session, we can extend that relationship out to what's called the MVT, or the minimum velocity threshold. That's the velocity or the speed at which you can successfully complete a 1RM. So it's the slowest movement you will still successfully be able to complete a lift. So different movements have different minimum velocity thresholds, and they will vary by exercise and by person. So in this situation, this example, bench press, a standard MVT is around 0.25 meters per second. If you're stronger, your MVT will actually be lower because you're able to grind through slower movement velocities and still maintain tension, maintain form without failing on the reps. That's a good thing. So in this situation, an MVT of 0.25 gives us an estimated 1RM of about 124 kilos. So we can perform this estimation in real time during a session from just your warm-up sets, maybe your first work set, and we can predict what your 1RM is on that day, taking into account today's velocities and loads. That gives us a really good readiness picture and a really good indicator of today's strength levels. Instead of using a percentage from a test we did, say, 6 or 8 weeks ago, we can use today's estimated 1RM and see what strength we are, and maybe use that in our programming. Maybe use that new estimated 1RM from today to tell us what percentages of load to do. So estimated 1RM, this MVT, like I said, it's exercise and individual specific. So this table here on the screen, this gives you a rough guide of some of the good numbers that we'll see. These numbers are pretty solid on the power lift rather. So squat, bench, deadlift, they have pretty stable fixed sort of numbers. So once you've tested yours a few times with an actual genuine 1RM and recorded the velocity on it, you should be able to reliably use that minimum velocity threshold for that lift for a while if you're an intermediate or an advanced level lifter. If you're a novice, your estimated 1 RM, your minimum velocity threshold is going to be bouncing all over the place. So it's going to need to be either tested regularly or ignored completely. But as you become intermediate into advanced, so you start lifting proper weights with good technique and good consistency, your MVT becomes quite stable. So you can start using it as a programming tool. MVT, like I said earlier, gets lower as you get stronger. That's because you're able to grind through slower velocities without losing position and without failing on the rep. So you want a slower minimum velocity threshold because that stretches out how far that estimated 1 RM is. So some deadlifters will get down as low as 0.06 meters per second, grinding out a slow, genuine 1 RM. And that means they've got really good grinding potential. They can keep moving that bar concentrically up and up into the lockout position and successfully complete the lift. A weaker athlete might only be 0.3. So they might be 6 times faster on that minimum because they just can't maintain position and grind through the weights because they don't have the force producing capacity. So how do we find that estimated 1 RM during a session? So you can do it in real time during training and you don't have to do any sets or reps outside your planned session. So you need to do at least 3 sets. So 3 sets across a range to get an accurate profile. Anything less and that linear trend line will start to bounce around too much and you get sort of random numbers. So 3 sets minimum, I prefer even 4. We need at least 1 set above 75% of your 1 RM. Now, this doesn't have to be exact because we're actually using this as an estimation tool. So 75% or up. So ideally, if you get one over 80, that's even better. But we need that heavy set in there to make sure if you are a weaker athlete, you're not being rewarded by lots of sub-maximal sets. If you do a set of 40, 50, and then 60% of your 1 RM, you might have an enormous predicted estimated 1 RM that day because you haven't actually done anything heavy. Those heavy sets can drag down the profile, so we need those in there consistently to get a consistent number. I used best rep velocity for each set. So say we'll use trap bar deadlift again. Say I'm doing trap bar deadlift, I do 60, 100, 120 for 3 warm-ups on that day to going towards 140. I take the best rep from the 60 kilo set, the best rep from the 100 kilo set, and the best rep from the 120 kilo set. I don't worry about the set average or the last rep. I only care about the best rep because that best rep indicates my absolute best effort for that day. So I take that rep and plug that into my profile. Obviously, also you need good technique here. So you don't want that athlete bouncing the weight, for example, or flicking it or trying to cheat in any way to get the rep. If you notice cheating as a coach, I would eliminate that rep. I wouldn't let that athlete keep that rep in their profile. And then I have a free calculator. So it's linked below in the description. I'll also put some screenshots coming up now as well. But I have a free profiling tool that you can use to estimate your 1 RM. So you can enter your body weight, your exercise, the minimum velocity threshold, and there's a series and a table of minimum velocity thresholds in the calculator. Enter load, enter velocity, and then you get these scores. The one we're focused on is 1 RM. Estimated 1 RM, either absolute or relative to body weight, depending on which you prefer. And you get the profile visually there as well. So how might we use this estimated 1 RM in your training? So here's a couple of examples. So you could use your day's estimated 1 RM as a substitute in a percentage-based training program. It's not the perfect way to use velocity in your training, but it's a pretty good start. So you can use a daily estimated 1 RM, maybe after your 4th and final warm-up set or the first work set of the day. Use that to determine today's estimated 1 RM and then work backwards from that for your percentages for, say, I'm doing 3x5 today at 87%. Take today's estimated 1 RM, times that by 0.87, there's your load for the day. So that allows an autoregulation system that matches your readiness. So your 1 RM will change on a daily basis, and this then correlates and matches that so your percentages are appropriate to today's strength levels. You can gauge progress. So instead of using it as a program tool, you can just use it as an indicator of progress. So do this weekly, daily, monthly, quarterly, whatever you like. Estimate your 1 RM on the key lifts that you really care about, and you can use that to gauge progress. So maybe you're in an off-season block as a powerlifter, not doing any heavy, real top work, and you're worried whether your strength levels are in fact going up. So you can use this sub-maximal estimation of 1 RM method to not break your program and not go off script and sort of start doing all these max outs to see where you're at. But instead, you can gauge the estimated 1 RM from sub-maximal sets to get a feel for, oh yeah, cool, this system tells me my 1 RM is still where it should be, or it's trending upwards over time, which is really what we want. And then you can also use it to find your proximity to failure. So with a minimum velocity threshold value, we'll talk about this more later, but with that minimum velocity threshold, you can determine how much exertion is within a set. So you can tell how close the last rep of a set got to that minimum velocity threshold, so how much gap is between the two, and you can then link that to RPE. And I'll talk more about that in a second when we talk about volume control. So we kind of hinted at this in the last section when we talked about the estimated 1RM, but velocity is a really good tool to track progress in your training. Now, if strength is your goal, if you're a powerlifter, obviously weight on the bar is your number one goal. And velocity-based training doesn't change that. It does not get in the way of that. But just maxing out and testing your 1RM every single session isn't a very smart way to train. You're going to smash your nervous system, you're going to be exhausted, you're going to burn out, and you're not going to get enough volume to create long-term adaptations. So we want to infer progress through other metrics. So you might have a rep RM, for example, so the most reps you've ever done at a given weight, or a new triple PR, for example. We can also use velocity in the same way. So we can have velocity PRs, a new fastest rep at a given load. And that's one of the really cool things about using velocity, is that then is a marker of progress. Even if those top weights aren't going up, if your sub-maximal velocities are going up, that's usually a good indicator that you're making this progress, or that those new load PRs are just around the corner. So velocity highlights adaptations. There's another way to highlight progress in your training and track it over time. This can indicate increased strength even if your top load isn't increasing. So say you're in a high volume block or a hypertrophy block, if those weights you're doing for say sets of 5, sets of 6, if you're seeing new velocity PRs on those sub-maximal loads, that's an indication that you are in fact getting stronger, even though you're not doing those heavy doubles and those heavy singles. And this can highlight improved efficiency, improved technique, all those kind of factors as well. And with velocity-based training, velocity isn't the only metric we use. You can also use range of motion metrics, tempo metrics, power if you so care. Those kind of things can also be indicators of progress. So if you're a sumo deadlifter, for example, shortening your range of motion while successfully locking out the bar is kind of an advantage because it makes you a more efficient lifter. So you can use range of motion, track that over time and see if you can shorten the range of motion of your sumo deadlift in order to become a more efficient lifter as well as a stronger lifter. Those things will both lead to an increase in your total. So one other way is what we talk about here is profiling scores. So scores we can track over time within sessions that give us an indication of our increased strength, even if we're not doing those new top PRs. So my favorite is a velocity PR, and it's highlighted here in this little blue cell. So for this 87.5 kilo set of bench press, for example, that 0.35 meters per second is the fastest I've ever done an 87.5 kilo bench press. It's not my top weight. I've bench pressed more weight than that, but for that weight, I've never moved it that fast. And that's an indication of increased strength, increased force production. So I'm heading towards maybe a new bench PR at my next peaking phase, for example. So it's a really easy way to go, okay, I set 2 new velocity PRs today, even though I didn't get to that top weight I'd planned. So these are good ways of indicating progress. The estimated 1RM, we've already talked about that. It's a really good way of tracking progress. Maybe you do this monthly, maybe you do it every single session, and you estimate that 1RM and use that as a way of predicting, okay, over time, that's generally going up and I'm getting a good trend upwards on my key lifts. And another score that might not be as relevant for powerlifting, given that the estimated 1RM is probably much more relevant to the sport, but another score is called the curve score. So this takes the surface area of the triangle of your load velocity profile, the entire space, and gives a single number to that score. It's in a number in the hundreds, or maybe a number between sort of 3 and 6 if you're talking about relative to body weight. If you take that score and divide it by your body weight, that gives you an overall picture of how well you performed on that exercise for a day. Really good for athletic development situations, say for example, rewarding athletes on their early sets, but it can also be a good indicator that you're doing good quality work in your training and that quality of work is increasing over time because your curve score is increasing. For powerlifting though, for strength specific athletes, I'd focus on the velocity PR and the estimated 1RM. I think those two are probably the most valuable. I think this is actually probably the area where velocity has the most potential to help strength athletes get more gains and optimize their training even further. So I think the tracking progress, the estimating 1RM, that's kind of fun and it's interesting, but I think actually adjusting your training in real time just a little bit when you need to is a much more valuable and a really high leverage way to use velocity in your training. So readiness is the ability to perform whatever you need to perform on a given day, and it fluctuates. So if we look at strength levels, this is a really good study here actually that shows changing strength levels on an actual genuine 1RM squat over the time. And you'll see the trend for these 3 subjects is in fact increasing, but you'll see there's lots of spikes. There's days when they were sore from yesterday's 1RM, or they went out with their friends for some drinks, and so they didn't sleep as well, and so their fatigue is higher than normal. So this readiness changes, and ignoring it is a bad idea. Instead, we want to do what's called autoregulation. So autoregulation is the adjustment of your training stress and life stresses to accommodate this changed readiness. So if you're feeling like crap and you're exhausted and you're tired and you're not lifting very well, there's no point going, toughen up, just push through it. We actually need to be, if you're a genuinely a hardworking athlete who enjoys working hard and there's a day when you're just not feeling it, then you should respond accordingly by adjusting your training. Now, I'm not saying don't go to the gym at all, curl up on the couch and call it quits. I'm saying we need to adjust the training session. Maybe it's just a little tweak here and there to make that session more optimal for the version of you that's walked into the gym. Because the version of you that's walked into the gym is not the same one that set that new PR last week. You've changed based on stress, moving house, breaking up with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, exams, all these different things, work stress, all these things will add up and accumulate into low or high readiness on a daily basis. So the big misconception when it comes to readiness is people think, you just want me to one day do nothing and the next day do everything based on good or bad readiness. It's not about these massive deviations. They are super rare. Most athletes, most high-performing strength athletes, team sport athletes, whatever it might be, won't have massive changes in readiness. Most days are in a really tight band as they perform. Instead, it's about subtly nudging the stress. So it's only when we require it, only when there's you're 5% down today or 7% down from normal today. Maybe we should do a little bit lighter session. Or you're 5% above normal today. Let's get after it. Let's break the plan a bit today and actually get after today's session and take advantage of being in a really good state of readiness. We're ready to push. Let's go. So I like to think of autoregulation application kind of like a pie chart. So about 50% of the time, and this is specific to velocity, but it could be heart rate variability, whatever other score you want to use along with velocity. But about 50% of the time, the velocity will have no impact on your planned session. You'll record it, you'll look at it, you'll assess it, you'll make some decisions, but you'll go, there's no need to change based on these. It's within that bandwidth, carry on. Another 25 or 30% of the time, the velocity is considered. So you maybe think about changing the plan. So you go, I'm a little low today. Should I adjust? And then you go, no, next week's a deload anyway. I can probably push through this session. And so it's considered, but you don't do it. That means somewhere between 70 and 80% of your training sessions, you'll look at the velocity data or whatever other readiness data it is, and you'll go, we're good, carry on, play on, I'll continue with the normal plan. So the idea that you're constantly changing plans based on velocity is not true. It's simply a bad way to train, and it's just going to lead to frustration. You're not going to know where you're at. You're not going to know if you're making good progress. It becomes exhausting as an athlete to be constantly adjusting your training. This is the interesting part though. That last 25, maybe 20% of the time, this is where velocity really plays its part and has a huge impact on your training. So maybe another 20% of the time, so this orange circle, this orange little section down the bottom, velocity maybe provides a slight nudge to your training. So instead of doing 3x5, maybe do 3x4. Or instead of doing 3x5 at 85%, you do 83%. So you round the weight down instead of rounding it up. Or the opposite, you're feeling good, you're doing great, so you round up on the numbers. You go, okay, I've got 3x5 drop-off sets today. It says to do between 100 and 105 kilos. I'm going to do the 105. I'm feeling good. I'm going to push it and go to the top end of that range instead of the bottom or the middle. So it helps you be conservative or aggressive in those times when you need to. And then this last, maybe, 1%, 2% of the time, velocity will give you a major shift to your planned session. Actually cutting entire work sets or dropping the weight completely by 10 kilos, like making big shifts to the session might happen once a year, twice a year kind of stuff. For some people, that won't even happen at all, ever. Their velocity will just be that consistent. They'll go, I'm good. I'm making a slight change or I'm making no change, carry on. So I think people think of readiness and autoregulation the other way around. They think that green section is everything. I'm constantly changing my training aggressively based on what's going on, but you're not. You're making slight nudges only when you need them. I think that's a big key. People overestimate how much velocity can change training or how much it should change training. So velocity, the reason this is really valuable, the reason I've talked about velocity so much in a readiness sense is that it's more sensitive to your readiness than the load you can lift and the force you can produce. So velocity serves as an early detection system of fatigue. So it basically tells you you're tired before you know you're tired. And it does that because our nervous system can still generate force. It just does it slower. So we become more grindy. So those way back in the first part of this presentation when I was talking about those days where the weights grind and it feels really heavy and sluggish, that's an indication of low readiness. You still complete the lift. And so that's not the issue here. The issue is that maybe that weight isn't quite optimal for me today based on this part of my training or this phase of or block of training that I'm in right now. And so velocity becomes that more sensitive measure of specific readiness for your lift. So you're doing your bench press and all your warm-up sets are just a bit slower than normal. Oh, maybe I'm a bit fatigued. Maybe I'm a little below where I should normally be for right now. So here's some ways to assess readiness with velocity. So you might have a suppressed estimated 1RM. So if you're estimating 1RM on a frequent basis and it stays down, it's going down maybe 2 weeks in a row or 2 testing cycles in a row, maybe that's indicating that you're overreaching, you're overtraining, you're not able to keep up with the level of volume and intensity that you're doing in your training. I prefer, though, a method called the below 30-day average method. So in this system, what you're looking for is your best rep velocity across all your weights, warm-ups and work sets included. You're looking to see if your best rep velocity is below your 30-day average for each load. And again, that might suggest neural fatigue relative and within the context of your own training history. So on your deadlift, you go 60, 100, 140, whatever it might be on those 3 weights. If you're 5-10% below your 30-day average for those same warm-up sets, because they're pretty consistent, pretty standard warm-up sets. If your best rep velocity is below your 30-day average for all 3 of those, you might be in a state of low readiness. If you have a faster fatigue rate, so if you're doing a block of training where you're always doing 5s, so everything's 3x5, for example, if you're finding that your fatigue numbers are much higher on those 5 reps than normal, so say normally 5 reps gives you about 20-25% velocity loss from the best rep of a set to the last rep of a set. If all of a sudden 1 week, instead of being 20-25%, it's 30-35% velocity loss, that might suggest that you're not able to do those full 5 reps as crisply as you were before. So you might not be fully recovered. You might be a bit more burnt out than you should be. And the other thing that isn't a velocity number is a higher RPE. So if you're doing those 3x5s and they're normally around 7 to 8 RPE, and all of a sudden 1 week they're 9 to 9.5 RPE, again, you might have low readiness. So today might not be the great day to push. So you might turn those 3x5s into 3x3s or 3x4s in order to get back into that RPE range, or just to deload and give your body a little bit of room, a little bit of space to recover for another hard session in the coming week. So I like the warm-up velocities as a way to indicate your fatigue status. So here's 2 examples. On the left is high readiness. That shows, see the 30-day average column there, column K on the end of the screen. I'll highlight it there. Those ones there, those green cells suggest that I'm above or within a bandwidth of my 30-day average for those sets and loads. So this is the velocity log calculator that you can get on my website. Again, it's linked in the description. You can get this, use this, and as you start accumulating data, you'll start getting a 30-day average that shows you your readiness. So for this day, the 7th of the 2nd in 2022, most of these sets are yellow. Yellow is no big deal, it's just be aware, but the rest of them are all green. So this is a good day, and include the velocity PR on that 87 kilo set. So that was a good day. On the other side of the screen though, we have the low readiness. So a low readiness set here on this squat day on the 17th of the 1st, it was just rubbish. The weights were moving slow, it was feeling sluggish, couldn't get anything going. So instead of being within that 30-day bandwidth, everything was red. So I was below 90% of my 30-day average for the exercise, which is not a good place to be. So I called it early, left it at 100 kilos, way lower than what I'd planned on doing that day, and just left it there. Did 200s, did a back off at 90, and that was it for the day. And even those back off sets, they were rubbish. And I could tell, I just felt slow, sluggish, and it was not a good day to push. So I adjusted and made the change so that I could recover for next week's squats and get a better session in. So some strategies for low readiness. You might minus or take off 1 rep from your work sets. So 3x5 becomes 3x4. You might reduce the weight for your back off sets. If you do back off sets in your strategy, one option here if you've got low readiness is still do your top set, but on your back off sets, maybe you cut the loads by 1, maybe 5, maybe even 10%. So if you plan to do back offs at 100 kilos, make them 95 kilos. Or instead of doing 3x5 back offs, do 3x3 back offs at the same weight. Things like that can help you just create a little bit of space so you can recover from your session. Cut 1 work or cut 1 back off set from the session. So if you're doing a lot of high volume, so 5x5, for example, one day maybe 4x5 is more appropriate. Or if you do a top double and then you do some back off 4s, instead of doing 3 sets of 4 for your back offs, just do 2 sets of 4 for your back offs. So cutting a little bit of volume there is a really clever way to go about it. In more extreme situations, you might cut your top set load. For strength athletes, I prefer not to cut that top set load. I try and find other ways to reduce volume, reduce training strain without cutting your top set weight too much. But if you need to, maybe taking 5 kilos, 2.5 kilos, maybe even 10 kilos off that top weight, just so that you can move it a little faster, a little more crisply, without that high RPE, without that extra neural load on your body, might be valuable. And then in really extreme situations, you might even cut accessory lifts completely. You finish your main competition deadlifts and they're rubbish and you're not feeling it, maybe you just do a couple of sets of RDLs instead of going hard on your RDLs as well. Or even really extreme situations, you should end the session early completely. Go home, get back in bed and rest. The one thing that isn't talked about enough when it comes to readiness is what to do when you've got high readiness. So, we talk so much about, I'm fatigued, I need to change, I need to reduce my training load. But what about those days when you're in the pocket, you're in the zone and everything's just feeling awesome? What do we need to do? Get after it. Those are the days when you should attack your training and get after a top weight. So maybe talk to your coach about whether this is appropriate for you during your training block. But maybe it's a situation where you actually need to get after the weights and attack it. So if you're feeling good, you're in week 4 of a block, everything's moving beautifully, you're doing doubles, maybe it's time to try that double PR. As long as you're within your RPEs, and again, talk to your coach, don't just say, Jacob, the VBT coach told me to do this. But if your velocities are up, the weight's feeling good, everything's, stars are all aligning, don't just follow the plan. Maybe those are days where you just sneak it up a little and get a little more out of it. I mean, the goal is to lift big weights, right? So if you're feeling good, let's go lift big weights. That's kind of the approach here. So I think taking advantage of high readiness is just as important as paying attention and listening to your body during low readiness. So they balance themselves out. So over the course of a training block or a cycle or an entire year, you should have just as many days where you adjust your training down as you maybe adjust your training up. Or, slightly increase the weight, go up by 5 instead of going up by 2.5, whatever the case might be there. So last piece on readiness is I think it's important to take an integrated approach. So there's no single one metric that provides all the answers in your training. Remember that the goal is to increase weight. So velocity is secondary to that. So that's why I encourage athletes to try and keep that top weight where it is and adjust all the other metrics around it. Velocity provides a lot of answers. It's a great objective measure of the quality of your training and how fresh you're feeling in real time, but it's only one metric, so it's not going to be the only answer. So if you're feeling great and your velocity numbers are a bit down, maybe you need to balance those two out and go, okay, well, the velocity's down, but I feel really good and these are moving fine. Coach says it looks good. Maybe I'll just continue with the plan anyway. But if you're feeling average, you didn't sleep very well, maybe your whoop or your aura ring data is a little low and your velocity numbers are low, maybe you need to adjust your session if you're also feeling average. So bring all this stuff together and have an integrated approach to your readiness assessments. So this is kind of a tangent to that last chapter. If we were talking before about being reactive with our autoregulation, so using warm-up sets to determine what we do in our work sets, for example, based on that 30-day average, in this situation, we're trying to be proactive, and particularly we're looking at controlling volume ahead of time. So we're going into a set or into a session with a planned volume control based on autoregulation. And so very wordy, but I'll explain what that means. So we're talking really about a dynamic rep count. So we're looking at repetitions in a set being determined by our readiness fatigue during that set. So there's a limit applied of some sort, we'll talk about the examples in a second, that ends the set if you reach a given threshold. So you're doing your sets, you reach a threshold and go, okay, I've reached that limit, that's enough, leave it there, that was 4 reps, done. And so the reps might change based on how quickly you fatigue across a set. So this is a graph here that shows velocity loss across a set. It's a set of 10, and you'll see the points where 10%, 20%, and 40% velocity loss are reached within that set. So this is one example of that stop threshold I was talking about. So a set is ended when that last repetition velocity reaches a given percentage drop from the best rep of a set. In this example, the best rep is the first rep, which is quite common. Sometimes it's first, sometimes it's second. But you stop the set when you reach a given percentage. So if we'd used a 10% threshold in this set example, that's 10 RM would have only been a triple. So it would have been like a RPE 3 or 4, would have been nothing. 20%, we're looking at sort of 5 reps. In this example, 5 reps out of 10 is not always the same. So 5 reps out of 10, looking at a 5 or a 6 RPE maybe for this one. 40%, we're looking at more like an 8, maybe a 9 RPE. So you can see that 9th rep is just below 40%. So depending on what threshold we set, what percentage of velocity loss we allow in a set, will depend on how many reps we do, how many we complete, and how close we get to our point of failure. There's really good research, and I'll link to this below in the description, that 20 to 25% is the sweet spot for developing maximum 1RM strength. So for powerlifting, for strength sports, 20 to 25% velocity loss seems to be the Goldilocks zone for your work. So doing most of your training in that zone seems to be the sweet spot. Doing more velocity loss or accumulating more velocity loss in your set doesn't seem to help with hypertrophy either. So if you're thinking about doing work for hypertrophy, adding more sets in that 20 to 25% velocity loss range is still going to be more optimal than just taking a single set out to a longer grind. 10 to 15%, even 5% in some power situations is a good velocity loss for tapering and power development. So it's like crisp triples, but with 3 or 4 reps in the tank might be a 10-15% velocity loss. And then 40%, in some situations, it's linked to an RPE 10. So 40% is often considered the point of failure, although it's not always the case. 40, sometimes you'll even see up to 50% fatigue before you reach the point of failure. So it does vary a bit, but 40% is a tough set either way. 20%, kind of pretty fresh, pretty crisp. 10%, very low volume. That's a taper or a peaking type situation. So how do we program with velocity loss? So here's 3 or 4 example actual specific training prescriptions using that velocity loss idea. So the first is a high volume situation. We're doing 4 sets with a question mark rep. So the rep number is open-ended at an 85% of 1RM or estimated 1RM. And the set ends once fatigue gets above 27.5%. So really we're looking for 30% fatigue here. So you keep doing reps until your velocity-based training technology tells you or beeps at you and says you've passed 27.5%. Every rep, lift it as hard as you can, really high intent. Once you reach that 27.5, the set ends. And so the idea is we're trying to accumulate fatigue. We're trying to work to a higher level. Here's a strength block example. So we're doing 3x4 at an 8 RPE if you use RPEs instead of percentages. The set ends once you reach 4 reps or the fatigue reaches 20 to 25%, whichever comes first. So if you're doing the set, you do 1, 2, number 3 is 26% or even 25%, you end the set at a triple. You don't do that 4th rep. And so this will change a bit. Tricky sometimes to work this in with RPEs, but you might do this on, say, the 2nd and 3rd set. The 2nd and 3rd of those work sets at 4 reps. So once you've picked the first one, got that 4 reps at 8 RPE, the follow-up sets or the back-off sets, for example, as well, they then have that limit. So they are the 4 reps or 25% velocity loss, whichever happens first. And so there's that little throttle on the set that stops you grinding through maybe an ugly last set if we didn't need that. Another example, maybe we're doing 3x6 here at 20% fatigue. So you keep adding load onto the bar until the 6 reps passes 20% velocity loss. That's now your day's working weight for those next 2 sets. So if you do this, do a set of 6 for a warm-up and you only achieve 15%, add more weight. Another set of 6 and you only achieve 18%, add more weight. Once you pass that 20% fatigue point, it could be 25%, depends what your goal is. But once you pass that 20% fatigue point in this example, that's now your work weight. And you're now going to do 2 more sets of 6 at that work weight. So it's a little more of a high volume. So maybe it's a high volume / strength block, probably more high volume now that I think about it. But that now gives you a good point to be with your training. So now you know what your weight is based on that auto-regulated velocity loss on the day. Another example, here's a peaking example, 2 sets of 3 at 9 RPE. Stop the set under these 3 conditions. Number 1, you reach 9 RPE. So you've got 1 rep left in the tank, you're done. The other option is 15% fatigue. So if you pass 15% fatigue, the set is also finished. So a lot of the times you might plan to go in with a triple, you do 2 and you go, I'm already at 8.5, maybe a 9 RPE, or I've passed that 12% or 15% fatigue, I'm done, cut the set. And the other option obviously is 3 reps. So we only ever want to do a maximum of 3 reps, but we might have a situation, given this is a high intensity peaking situation, where we might only get doubles before we go double, 15% fatigue or an RPE 9, leave it there. So the other option here is to use a fixed last rep velocity. So instead of looking at percentage decline from the start of the rep to the end of the set, we can set the last rep velocity based on how close we want to get to our point of failure. So in this graph here, we've got a load velocity profile, but we've also got two maximum effort sets, one at 85 kilos and one at 95 kilos. And what you'll see is the last blue dot on both of those sets is about 0.25 meters per second, which is our minimum velocity threshold. So just like the 1RM has a given failure velocity, the last velocity you'll successfully be able to complete a rep at, it's the same for a 10RM or a 5RM. They all have a velocity endpoint around the same point. And we can use that number to link to RPE and to tell us how close we want to get to our failure point on those given weights. So there's a really high link to RPE for experienced powerlifters between last rep velocity and RPE numbers. So you can use this arbitrarily, or you can base it on a minimum velocity threshold. So it doesn't, even if you don't know your minimum velocity threshold, you can still set an end last rep velocity number for your sets and change that over the course of a program. This helps control overworkers and stops overtraining athletes from pushing too hard when they should be doing lower RPE sets. So if you've programmed for them to be doing 6.5 to 7.5 RPE, but they keep just taking them out to 8.5s and 9s, you can use the last rep velocity to control that, to not let them go below a certain point. And so say, for example, their minimum velocity threshold is 0.25. You can set a cap at none of these reps are allowed to be below 0.35. So there's a 0.1 meter per second buffer before the point of failure, which should be 2 or 3 reps. That means they're going to be leaving at least 2 or 3 reps in the tank before they end their set. So they can get to their RPE, or they can get to your velocity cut point, whichever happens first. It also encourages lifters to move with intent to avoid an early end to the set. So if they're training and their set ends when they go under 0.35 meters per second, then saying you're not allowed to lift under 0.35 will keep them pushing through the weights hard so that they can get those extra reps. So it both controls and encourages hard workers to give good intent on their training, depending on how you frame it as a coach. There's a little bit of a coaching skill and art in that as well. So here's a few practical ideas for programming with those velocity stops. Here's the first one. It's a high volume example. We got 4 times question mark. So it's an open-ended rep scheme. The sets start, so the 4 work sets start once the velocity of that best rep, the fastest in the set, is below 0.6. So we're working with zones here. So we've got a top zone at which point the velocity, the sets would start. So that load is now heavy enough to be considered a work set. And the sets will continue. So each set continues, you continue doing reps until the last rep falls below 0.3 meters per second. So this is a really high volume, high exertion program. So this is going to be really high RPE stuff. And you're probably going to be looking at sort of 8, maybe even 12 reps on this stuff between 0.6 and 0.3 meters per second. So you have to get heavy enough to get below the 0.6, but once you're there, you have to keep repping it out until you get to 0.3 meters per second. So that's going to be a tough, high volume way to program. And you can play with those bands, the actual velocity you use, based on the individual factors. So you need to play around to work out what velocities work for this. Here's an example of a strength block: 3 times 3 to 4 reps at an 8 RPE or a 0.25 meters per second velocity. So the set ends at 8 RPE or 0.25 meters per second, whichever comes first. So if you get to 0.25 but you think you're only at 7.5, the set ends regardless. Strength block number 2, we got 3 times question mark, so it's an open-ended rep scheme at a 95% intensity. Now the set here ends once a rep falls below 0.25 meters per second. So the same velocity cutoff, but the load is a bit more fixed. So we've fixed it at 95%. We're going to keep doing reps until we fall below 0.25. So it's probably going to be doubles, triples, maybe 4s in this situation, depending on the exercise. Peaking. This is a really intense peak, so we're really actually looking for a velocity PR, a new load PR rather, in this situation, so a new 1RM really with this. So it's 2x1 at 0.2 meters per second down to 0.17 meters per second. So again, we've got a zone. So we've got 0.2 down to that very tight 0.17. You continue adding load until a single is below 0.2. Once you're below that, you then have a decision to make whether you go up a little heavier for that second single or you leave it and you just repeat and do 2 singles at that weight. We want to try and chase a really high intensity stimulus here. So it's 1 rep, maximum load, really slow velocity. But again, we're still trying to increase the velocity. So it's a relative velocity, but it's going to be slow and it's going to be a grind because we're pretty close to 100% of 1RM here. If not, a new 1RM is ideally the goal. So last section for this very long, thanks for hanging around video, is to look at VBT and RPE. They're two often put on opposite sides of the table and then talk about, well, you're either RPE or you're either velocity, but they work quite nicely together. And so if we think about last rep velocity and we take these bands here of RPE compared to the load velocity profile, what we'll see is that, like those sets to failure we talked about before, the last rep of say a 10 RM, for example, will also fall around the same last rep velocity as your 1 RM. So once you know your minimum velocity threshold that we talked about earlier in the video, once you know that value, you can then focus in on, okay, well, that's my last rep velocity for most weights, so you can assume. And then you go, okay, how close I get to that determines how much exertion, how close I got to my failure point, and will also therefore be connected to my RPE. So if I'm at 0.27 meters per second, in this example, that's an RPE 8. I've got about maybe 1, maybe 2 reps left in the tank before I get to that RPE 10. So you can use this to determine your RPE. So there is a direct link between velocity and RPE once you've built this system and you know your values. So that introduces the idea of a hybrid approach where you integrate velocity and RPE into certain systems. And there's a few examples of that. The first one is to estimate your RPE. So do what you normally do your set and go, okay, that was an 8 RPE, but then review velocity and use that to calibrate your RPE skills and go, oh, okay, I actually had more in the tank than I thought. That was maybe more like an RPE 7 or a 7.5, or the opposite. Or that was way tougher than I feel like it was. And so this can help calibrate your RPE skills, which is still a really important thing to get right, whether you train with velocity or not. The other option is you can directly pull your RPE value from that last rep velocity. So from that chart that was just on the screen before, you can use that to directly pull an RPE value from your last rep velocity. So last rep velocity was 0.3, that correlates with an RPE 8. I call it an RPE 8. So it's really fixed and it's determined exactly by the last rep velocity. So there's no need anymore to actually subjectively assess your RPEs with that model. Quite extreme, takes a little bit of calculation. You've got to get the spreadsheet out and make sure you work out what your minimum velocity thresholds are and the percentages and things like that. Do a few test sets of different RMs to make sure they all match up. And then you can start using that. Probably not my preferred method. I still think the value of learning to subjectively assess RPEs and give it a number is an important skill in powerlifting and strength sports. The other option is to estimate your RPE, then review velocity, get an RPE value from the velocity, and then take an average. So RPE, I say 7, the velocity number says 8, let's call it 7.5. That's one other hybrid approach of integrating the two together. And you could do it the other way. You could go velocity first, RPE second. It depends on, you really want to play around with this stuff and see what you think. That's one way to do it. I actually prefer the idea of doing separate applications. So using RPE and velocity to do separate jobs in your training program. So use RPE to determine your load and rep track. So you program all of your training with RPE systems, just as you currently are, for example. Then you track progress with velocity using the velocity PR and or the estimated 1RM that we talked about earlier in the video. So you do an estimated 1RM profile more sessions than not, and you use that to track progress whilst training within an RPE framework. That's one way to do it. And then track velocity PRs as like an incentive to show that you're making progress at the right time in your training blocks and cycles. Another option is to use a traffic light velocity system. This is something I'll talk about in a future video, but traffic light velocities is the idea of what your velocity on your best rep today is compared to your 30-day average, and use that to determine readiness and therefore load, and then use RPE to determine the rep count. So you set load based on traffic lights. So good day, I'm going to go up. Bad day, I'm going to repeat the weight or go backwards, and then use RP to determine the rep count. So the load is determined by warm-up set velocity. Okay, cool, great, feeling good, going to go up by 5 kilos today. We're going to go from 160 to 165, whatever. But then once I'm at that, the program calls for 8 RPEs. So I'm going to do that 165 for the planned 4 reps. Hopefully it's going to be an 8 RPE. That means I know I've got it right. And again, you're constantly adjusting with this stuff, always calibrating, taking little ideas, tweaking things to get those numbers right, to keep yourself on program, on plan, and making good progress. So that's a long video. Thanks for sticking around. Hopefully you got some value from this stuff and some interesting ideas about how to integrate velocity into your strength training program. Now I've got a VBT book called the VBT Field Guide. You can check it out in the link below. That's got heaps of fundamental stuff and advanced applications of velocity-based training all in one place. So all the ideas and all the good stuff about how to use velocity in your training is in that book. Please check it out. I've also got a free velocity logbook. That's also linked below in the description. Check out that velocity logbook. That's got some really cool ideas and ways you can track your velocity data so that you can get the velocity 30-day average, get some contextual stuff, track and measure your velocity PRs over time, all within that logbook. That's free. Get that on my website. I've also got all the other stuff linked below in the description. Let me know how you go. Any questions, don't hesitate to reach out, and happy lifting.